Welcome to an hour of provocative and timely conversation on the most important topics of the day. This program is for critical thinkers. And now, here's your host, integrated media professor, longtime Spokane Talk radio personality, and award-winning broadcast veteran, Mike Fitzsimmons.
Well, good afternoon to you, and welcome to this edition of For Critical Thinkers. We're going to delve into an area called political science today. Now, I'm not talking about the university definition of political science. I'm talking actually about the study of how politicians manipulate actual science in order to achieve their objectives. We're not going to get into the Magna Carta or Machiavelli today or John Locke, but rather just how the politicians at the present time are using science to convince us to act in matters that are maybe not necessarily in our best interest under some circumstances. Now, let me tell you first off how you can get involved in the program today. So if you have a PC or a Mac or a smartphone, and it has a camera and it has a microphone, and if you want to participate, you contact Sam, our producer, and Sam will show you just exactly how to join live on the program today. He'll give you a password, show you how to register in, and you'll have the opportunity then to participate in the program live with me if you choose to do so. Of course, this program is going out live over the Facebook page of Spokane Talks Media.com, but it also will be on YouTube in a short while before this day is over, and then you can access it anytime you want to. Also, let me mention that we cannot do this without the generosity and the support of our alternate benefactor, Stephen Major. Stephen, we thank you always, of course, for your support of this program. We appreciate it. And indeed, that's important to us for us to be able to proceed with this. We always start the program off with a definition of what critical thinking is. And what critical thinking is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. Now, that sounds pretty simple, but it's not easy at all. As a matter of fact, most Americans are not critical thinkers, which in large measure is why we're in the mess we're in right now. And I'm not here to have you agree with me or disagree with me. You choose that as you will. I'm here to challenge you to become a critical thinker. And I know that regardless of whether you agree with me or disagree with me, we'll be in a better place if more people become critical thinkers. Now, do you trust science? Do you trust science? Most polls show that Americans respect and trust science in general, and medical science in particular. Most polls show that Americans believe that scientists truly do try to arrive at the truth to the best of their ability, and that they really don't let politics get in the way. Although that's not true of all scientists, it's true of most. And so we do trust science, and we should trust science. Science has certainly contributed a great deal to our society over the years, and indeed they've earned our trust. But you need to know something. Here's a caution that we should keep in mind when we critically evaluate government policy that is supposedly based on science. Take a look at this. Science and uncertainty go hand in hand. This is a well-known fact for anyone, any scientist or expert in his or her field. However, it is not so well known in the general public. Politicians need steady facts to produce policy. And that is something, by the way, that science can never actually deliver. So understand, when we're told by the politician we're abiding by the science, that typically isn't going to be true in its entirety. Political science, that is the art of the possible. And when political science meets the discipline of scientific inquiry, real scientific inquiry, then of course there can be some conflicts. And the number one thing is that political objectives usually require convincing and persuading. Science seeks proof. And because of that, we have an almost automatic conflict, if you will. For example, lately we are supposed to believe that and accept that if a male identifies as a female, that person should be able to compete in women's sporting events. Liberal politicians say that it's science, but most Americans know it is science fiction. Male and female, those are the two genders. Those are the ones God gave us. The liberals and the Democratic Party gave us the other 37. But you and I both know when we're treading on thin ice when it comes to reasoning with respect to these sorts of things. Where true science won't support public policy, political advocates are perfectly happy to bend the truth a little bit. So that brings us to the issue of political science and COVID-19. Such is the case with political science and COVID-19. The truth has been bent a bit, and we've bought it hook, line, and sinker in some cases. It is just one of many cases of, if you will, exercises in science fiction. These exercises in science fiction, of course, make us believe things that aren't necessarily true, and actually will cause us to fight hard for things that we believe in, even if we don't know whether they are true or they are not. In the subject of COVID-19, let us begin with the World Health Association, or Organization, WHO. Now, you know and I know that the WHO is supposed to be the place where the world turns to get the scientific truth on global health matters. Well, would that were true, but it isn't. The WHO is a part of a vast network of political activity under the guise of health. Most Americans don't realize just exactly how the WHO is structured, who pays for it, and what those folks get, those various nations get for their investment. In the COVID-19 episode, the WHO lied to us. They lied to us about the COVID virus. From the very beginning, they did. They lied to us about the virus being transmitted from animals to humans. WHO said that the coronavirus could not be transmitted from animals to humans. Remember, it was supposedly started in a marketplace in Wuhan, China, and it came from bats and it couldn't be transmitted. Well, the reality of it is that at the time in which WHO was telling you that, it actually knew that it could be and was being transmitted, and it didn't come from a marketplace. They said it came from a marketplace, but the WHO was actually acting in China's best interests here. That's a political move, not a scientific move. The WHO protected China's interests by spreading propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party. And part of it was that it came from a marketplace. They also told us that it wasn't a problem in Wuhan. The WHO protected China's interests by spreading propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party. And part of that propaganda was about lies regarding the origin of COVID-19. They claimed that it was under control in Wuhan. They claimed that it was not produced in the Wuhan virology laboratory, and they claimed that it was not a public health threat. At all times, the World Health Organization knew indeed that it was, and it was for the rest of the world to discover it and to then try to craft some type of a response to that discovery. And it became clear about a year ago now that the American population actually was threatened by this, even though the WHO was still claiming in March of last year that there was no real significant threat to Americans or to any other folks around the world. The knee-jerk reaction, of course, in many states in this country was to force the population to shelter in place and lock down. lockdown. And we're still, in many regards, in lockdown. Now, President Trump, you may recall if you go back and look at the news at that time, President Trump was excoriated for not ordering a national lockdown. The president did not order a national lockdown. Indeed, Trump and the governors clashed over the whole lockdown issue. He respected the emergency powers of the state's governors, and he chose not to interfere with those, but rather to provide support wherever possible from the federal government. And he clashed with governor policies with respect to the lockdown, killing the economy, trampling on the rights of citizens, and a variety of other areas of concern that he expressed. Enter Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He became, as you know, the face of the scientific authority behind government measures in the area of COVID-19, the guru of the entire saga so far. And he said on March the 15th of 2020, almost a year to the day ago, he made the statement that he'd like to be criticized for being too overactive in containing the spread of coronavirus. And so Fauci, who had flip-flopped frequently on the subject of whether or not to support lockdowns a year ago, threw his support behind him. And as of April the 5th of last year, just a month after he came to grips with this and decided that the lockdown was the best answer, nearly half the nation was locked down. Schools closed, businesses deemed non-essential, which were most businesses, closed, and people were afraid. Fear was one of the major drivers of this whole process. And that fear continues today, although it is dissipating now, and perhaps the intelligence of the people is beginning to overcome the fright that they experienced in that first few months. The decision to lock down was unique for COVID-19. You see, there were no lockdowns before when we had major pandemics. No lockdowns at all during major pandemics in the past 100 years. Unique to COVID-19. And one might question, if you're a critical thinker, why did we do this as opposed to what we did in the past? What was it that science really didn't know that we were up against, that seemed to be the right kind of an answer? Certainly the goalposts were being moved. In fact, they were being moved almost every week in the early part of March and April of 2020. We had a number of major pandemics in the last 100 years. Take a look at these. We had the HIV/AIDS pandemic. 36 million people were killed from 1981 to the present day under that. That pandemic, by the way, is over with, but AIDS is certainly not eradicated. The Hong Kong flu pandemic of 1968 was another big one. It killed 1 million people worldwide. We did not lock down then. We did not lock down over AIDS. The Asian flu pandemic, 1956 to 58, was major too. Killed 2 million people across the globe. We did not lock down then. The Spanish flu pandemic back in 1918, you've heard so much about. It killed between 20 and 50 million people. And we did not lock down then. In fact, the prevailing view for public health officials and political leaders of the time in all of those various pandemics was two things, twofold. You isolate the sick and you isolate the most vulnerable. Public health policy took a very different direction with COVID-19. We locked everybody down, separated all of the population, told them they had to wear masks, had to wash their hands frequently, had to use sanitizer, had to socially distance. That was a different kind of an approach to this, on the theory that somehow or other this was going to be the best approach, even though we had a pandemic experience, lots of it, and we never used this particular strategy to work against it. So one has to ask you, a critical thinker has to ask, What made this pandemic different from the rest? Did we know any more about, for example, the Spanish flu in 1918 when it first hit than we did about COVID when it first hit? Then why did we choose with COVID the direction of lockdown, the direction of isolating the American population from one another for an indefinite period of time, when we did not do that in 1918 or 1958 or 68? Why did we do that? Whose decision was that? And why were we moving in that particular direction? The governors of the several states have what are known as emergency powers. Emergency powers. Most governors declared a state of emergency in their state, and that triggered these certain emergency powers. And they're to be exercised by governors and mayors and health districts and what have you. But amazingly, in the U.S., the governors, particularly in blue states, took upon themselves powers that weren't even stated in the Emergency Powers Act in their own states, the Federal Emergency Powers Act, the constitutions of the several states from the U.S. Constitution. Indeed, the U.S. and state constitutions were literally ignored. Governors acted like dictators. They acted like dictators. They suspended rights guaranteed under the Constitution. They arrested worshipers for attending church, but they permitted lots and lots of street violence and street riots and never seemed to arrest anybody for violating COVID lockdown rules. They allowed shopping at a Home Depot or a big box store like Walmart or Lowe's or whatever. They closed all the local hardware stores. The mom and pop stores that sold the same sorts of products could not do business, but the big box stores could. Was that science or was that economic policy, economic politics? They suspended elective surgeries. Couldn't get a hip replacement or a knee replacement, but they permitted abortions to continue. Isn't an abortion an elective kind of a procedure? You see what I'm getting at? They used the crisis to shut down gun stores, to shut down all kinds of stores, all kinds of jobs, and to ignore the Constitution of their own state and many times the U.S. Constitution in the process. Incoherent mandates were imposed. Arbitrary, capricious orders issued. Many evidencing political objectives, not public health objectives. Andrew Cuomo of New York, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Gavin Newsom of California, Jay Inslee of Washington, Phil Murphy of New Jersey, Tom Wolf of Pennsylvania. I call these guys the dirty half dozen. These people literally ascended to a position of dictatorship in their states. The rationale for the things that they did and continue to do today just simply doesn't cut it, doesn't pass the smell test. Most of the heaviest-handed mandates came from blue state governors, have you noticed? And by the way, they didn't follow the mandates they set for us. You'll recall that Gavin Newsom, for example, was, after having told us that we should not go out to eat, went out with his buddies for a particular party in Southern California one day, that Whitmer's husband decided that even though nobody was supposed to take their boats out onto the lake, he went up and told the local officials at one of the marinas in northern Michigan that he was the husband of the governor and he wanted to go out on his boat. Phil Murphy told everybody that they shouldn't have Thanksgiving with their families, and then he had Thanksgiving with his. This is the kind of stuff that really irritates people when they find out that people they believed in, trusted, and were supposedly applying the science weren't applying it at all. It was, those are rules for thee, but not for me. The saddest part of all this is that small businesses were devastated. The U.S. lost 9 million businesses over the last 12 months. Did or will have by that time. Right now, the number is just a little under 9 million. Small businesses were devastated, especially restaurants and bars and salons and bakeries and gymnasiums and such. Unbelievable how destructive these were. These were ma and pop businesses for the most part. Ma and pop businesses. Many times retailers who were operating in the same marketplace as the big box stores that were allowed to stay open and allowed to operate, and they were not. Where's the science in that? If you have a big box store that has 200 or 300 people shopping at a given time, and you have a small hardware store, for example, that has maybe 15 or 20 people, who's likely to be the super spreader? And where is the science? But more than important than that, and far more offensive to me is, where is the equality of treatment under the law? Where is the protection of individuals under the 14th Amendment? By the end of 2020, nearly 20.8 million Americans had lost their jobs. Now, some jobs are coming back, but there's still nearly 10.5 million Americans unemployed as we speak. Nearly 21 million Americans unemployed overall, and the fall from economic prosperity to despair, as you know, was immensely quick. It happened so fast. Now, was this response necessary? One has to ask, did we have to close up all these businesses in order to protect ourselves and our health? Did we have to? Looking back, it appears as though we did that arbitrarily, out of fear perhaps, but certainly not out of measured good sense policy making that was predicated on genuine science. Were lives actually saved by having done this? No, indeed. We find out that some of these drastic measures in fact took lives. I cite as evidence the Andrew Cuomo nursing home scandal. 15,000 elderly people died. The lockdown was literally killing us. And there was more than that, of course. We had people who were in despair. We had substance abuse. We had suicides. We had mental health issues. We had all kinds of true medical and public health matters that were escalating in their intensity at the same time that we were trying to save ourselves from a pandemic that almost 99% of the people who got sick would recover from. Where's the science in that? Politicians invested in this whole process. They were insisting that they were handling all of this right. They insisted that this was the best answer. People began to push back. Started seeing signs, for example, on closed down business reader boards like this one. We want our jobs back. You started seeing demonstrations on street corners. You started seeing people carrying placards. You started seeing folks saying, wait a minute, we're not buying this. And of course, the press and the politicians excoriated these folks, beat up on them, claimed that they were dangerous people for doing this sort of thing, shamed them. Despite government giveaway programs, so-called stimulus programs, some of which worked, some of which haven't. How did you get your second stimulus check, for example? That's supposed to have gone out 6-8 weeks or more ago. Anyway, the public became less and less convinced that the governors, that the mayors, that the federal officials were, in fact, doing the right thing here. The governors claimed that they were following the science. They insisted all along, we're following the science. Nothing we're doing is outside of that. This is all about keeping people safe, they told us. They weren't keeping us safe. I mentioned the suicides, the mental health issues, the depression, the substance abuse. These governors were issuing arbitrary and capricious mandates because they could. But were they following the science? The jury says, no, false. They were not following the science. It wasn't about the science. That was the pretext. That was the pretense they were using. Last fall, for example, the Los Angeles health officials shut down outdoor dining in LA due to an alleged spike in COVID cases. The move all but killed the restaurant industry in Southern California, which already was hanging on by a thread. And what did they discover? No science link between outdoor dining and COVID-19 spike. In other words, it was arbitrary and capricious. That kind of thing happened a lot. Pennsylvania's Governor Tom Wolf closed churches. He prohibited funerals and weddings. He closed gymnasiums where not a single case of COVID could be traced to have originated. He restricted travel. He prevented families from visiting each other, especially elderly members of families who were in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. And then on September the 14th of 2020, just a few months back, a federal judge ruled a significant portion of the Pennsylvania governor's COVID-19 related shutdowns were just simply flat unconstitutional. And that could be the ruling for a number of other lawsuits that are against a variety of other states right now who claim to be following the science, but we're not at all. What about your rights? What about your constitutional rights, state and local, as well as the federal Constitution, in circumstances such as this? Did you forget you have them? Your politicians did. We'll take a break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about that.
Ella was diagnosed with pretty rare cancer, metastatic Ewing sarcoma. Ella was 20 when she passed. I didn't know much about Wishing Star, and we got to know them quite well. They came for regular visits. Just mostly we got to know Ella and spend time with her and find out what her interests and what she liked to do.
We had a lot of support, having had them kind of with us through the whole situation. We knew that they knew what it was like for us. They were just really wonderful.
Even for after Ella passed away, and just helped out tremendously. They were like our right hand, just helping with flowers, and we even trusted them to, take her urn and move it from the funeral to the reception, things like that. Wishing Stars stayed connected with us, and that's meant a lot to our family.
Welcome back to this edition of For Critical Thinkers. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons. We are a constitutional republic in these United States. A lot of folks don't know what that even means. But if you did, and if you followed the Constitution at all, or if you've ever read it, you know that something was not quite right about the way we're handling this situation, and you'd be suspicious. Here's a little cartoon that I think is pretty interesting. This has to do with, of course, the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And you have one of the founding fathers saying, okay, but none of this counts if people get sick, right? And the answer is wrong. Constitution counts no matter whether the nation is sick or well. Nowhere in the Constitution, indeed, is there a provision that authorizes the suspension of any of the constitutional provisions during a pandemic. It's the supreme law of the land. Mostly liberal politicians acted like this Constitution doesn't even apply. Lawsuits triggered almost all across the United States have thus far succeeded on constitutional grounds because the courts know that the politicians have not been following the Constitution faithfully. In fact, in the state of California, Governor Gavin Newsom is in serious trouble. The people of California who once supported Gavin Newsom with a great deal of enthusiasm have had a bit of a change of heart, and he may well soon be recalled. And then, of course, we have the situation with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who could be removed from office also. There's a push to have him resign or to perhaps impeach him or perhaps to recall him. removing him from office in any event, and he could face criminal charges, indeed, in the nursing home matter. So the facade of we're doing this for science, don't question what we do, is starting to unravel very quickly now as people are realizing that, wait a minute, we may have been had here. We may very well have been had here. Also, foremost on our minds, especially if we're parents of school-age kids, is the whole back-to-school question. If you've been following the news, you know that the vast majority of American parents want their kids back in the classroom. The school suspension part of the lockdown is not very popular right now. And school districts and politicians say that they're following the science. Well, let's look at the science. Here's what the CDC says. The CDC just a few days back said that schools can safely reopen without vaccinating teachers. It was just about a month ago that they came out with that. And they went on to say that CDC research shows a low risk of COVID-19 infections among students in in-person schooling environments. This just came out in the last few days. New CDC research showing a low risk of COVID-19 infections among students in in-person schooling. In other words, there is nothing holding us back from sending our kids to school. Nothing at all. The science says send them. Why aren't they in the classroom? Can't be the science, and it can't be politicians following the science if indeed this is where we are. The Biden administration says that they faithfully follow the science when it comes to schooling for K through 12 students. Biden follows the science, he says. He vows to do so, and he does so. That's what the president tells us. In fact, here is what he said. Here's a direct quote from him. The science says that to be safe, I must go slowly as we move toward a return into the classroom learning. Therefore, the goal of the first 100 days of my administration is to have school kids back at least one day a week. 1 day a week. Wait a minute. So 4/5 of the classrooms will be empty for most students all week long. President Biden has stated his policy, and he has thrown his press secretary just in the last week or so under the bus. Jen Psaki under the bus for telling the reporters at a recent press briefing of the White House press corps that the president's position is to have, by the end of 100 days of his administration, his first 100 days, to have students back in the classroom at least 1 day a week. Well, now, the president is measuring which way the political wind is blowing. He's not looking at science. He'll follow the politics, and he's not interested in the science. So you have to ask the question, if you're a critical thinker, is Biden following the science? He says he is. Is Biden following the science? The media continues to protect Biden. They continue to say that he is. They carry the water for this indecisive president. But Biden is not following the science. The answer to that question is false. In fact, far from it. Like many politicians, Biden's open schools policy isn't based on the science, even though he claims that it is. Biden is treading water, trying not to incur the wrath of the nation's teachers' unions, the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers. Biden raked in over $230,000 in the 2020 election period. And liberals are backing him because they raked in nearly $23.5 million from the NEA and an additional $14 million from the AFT in the election of 2020. So, teachers' union is calling the shots, not Joe Biden. Not until they back down will he back down. Still, Biden and local school officials say that they are following the science and that the science prevents them from opening up K through 12 education completely. Some teacher locals even say that they will strike if there's an effort to open up the schools against their will. Are you getting the trend here? Where's the science in this? I can see clearly, and so can you, the politics, but where's the science here? I've explained to you what the scientists say, but I also explained to you that science and politics is often oil and water. It really doesn't go hand in hand, generally speaking, because scientists have a great deal of inquisitiveness, if you will, curiosity, and a level of skepticism about the things that they study. And politicians have to have it absolutely certain, black and white, so they can sell it to the public to meet the objectives that they happen to have, which are very often partisan. Which brings us to the great American mask debate. The great American mask debate. Are we truly afforded a significant level of protection by the cloth masks that we wear? Some swear we are. Some say we aren't. Are we truly threatened by people who decline to wear a mask? Well, let's start with the science claimed by the people who do not feel compelled to wear a mask. The ones who say masks don't work. Once again, we bring back Dr. Fauci. March the 8th of 2020. Just a year ago today, practically. He was walking around telling us there is no reason to be walking around with a mask. That's what he said. No reason to be walking around with a mask. It was only a year ago that Anthony Fauci, the COVID-19 guru, told us that we did not need to wear masks. The CDC, the World Health Organization, federal, state, and local health experts knew the very same thing. They knew the score only a year ago. Look at this statement with respect to the COVID pandemic. It's about viral transmission, the CDC said a year ago. Surgical and cloth masks do nothing to prevent viral transmission. We should all realize that by now, the face masks have never been shown to prevent or protect against viral transmission, which is exactly why they have never been recommended for use during the seasonal flu outbreak, epidemics, or previous pandemics. That answers one of the questions we asked just a little bit ago, didn't it? We asked, why didn't they lock down? Why didn't they wear masks? Why didn't they do? Because they didn't work, and they knew they didn't work. October 20th of 2020, the CDC study found the following: that those infected by COVID-19 who always wore masks were the majority of those infected by COVID-19. Now, if the masks work, obviously you can't be infected by COVID-19 greater than the numbers of folks who were not, but they were. Indeed, back in 2015, the CDC study indicated that cloth masks provide 97% ineffective protection. Cloth masks blocking influenza-like viruses. COVID-19 is a smaller than a typical seasonal virus, and the CDC said, really? You're not protected at all. Now, that was the science going into COVID-19. Just a year ago, that's what everybody believed. So let's take a look at the case for wearing masks. What do the folks who claim the science says masks do work justify their position with? By the way, this is also the preferred political position in the United States in a majority of states. Here's the statement. The science supports using masks, with recent studies suggesting that they could save lives in different ways. Research shows that they cut down the chances of both transmitting and catching coronavirus, and some studies hint that masks might reduce the severity of infection in people if people do contract this disease. Here comes Dr. Fauci again. And this time, Dr. Fauci is saying that, you know what, maybe we ought to be wearing 2 masks. He says, if you have a physical covering with 1 layer, you put another layer on, it just makes common sense that it likely would be more effective. And he said that just a few days ago on the 1st of March of this year. Now remember, if you're a critical thinker, once no mask was necessary at all. No mask was recommended, even by Dr. Fauci. And somehow, Fauci now says we ought to be wearing 2 masks. So I have to ask, and the critical thinker must ask, well, if we wore 2 masks and that would be better, then does that not tell us, those of us who had such faith in the single cloth mask for all those months that we religiously wore them, that we were sure that they were saving our lives, and now we're told, actually, you may need a second mask. You may actually need a second mask. 1 mask may not be enough. And then Fauci went on to say something else that makes me wonder if I'm a critical thinker, and I am, and it should make you wonder as well. What about these vaccines? What about the 3 COVID-19 vaccinations? Do we not have enough faith in them to expect to shed our masks before this year is over with? Well, here's what Dr. Fauci also said on the 1st of March. We may have to wear masks into mid-2022. Really? Really? We may have to wear masks not only this year, but midway through next year as well. This is problematic for me. It ought to be problematic for you too. And the reason is that it sort of underscores, or if you will, unravels the faith that we thought was rock solid in the wearing of the mask in the past. Now, what's really particularly interesting is that after all this argument has taken place, and it's been going on, and sometimes it's been pretty intense, the position of the CDC in the end has basically gone back to the default position they had in 2015 with respect to masks. I'll tell you what the latest CDC position is when we return on this edition of For Critical Thinkers.
Hi, my name is Liam, and I'm 6 years old.
Liam was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at pretty much at birth, with Liam having to do treatments, breathing treatments every day. It's very worrisome because around our area there's a lot of fires, and then there's harsh weather. So there was a day this summer where we were out of electricity. I want to say 5 in the morning till maybe 5 in the afternoon, and it was very hard for me not to have electricity because, we couldn't do his treatments. We spoke to Wishing Star and they were able to get us a generator, which was a really big stress relief. Anything could happen any given moment. We will be able to do his treatments and clear his lungs, even if there's fires or any kind of weather. For the donors of Wishing Star, I don't know where would we be, without them, with this donations that they do for us.
Welcome back to this edition of For Critical Thinkers. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons. As we left, we put up a panel that I want to put up again for you. In the end, the science seems to suggest just about what it did in 2015. The CDC recently updated its guidance to state that face masks provide, and this is the language they're using now, some personal protection against COVID-19 for those who wear them, not just for those around them. The new data from a randomized controlled study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine showed that wearing a mask was slightly more effective, slightly more effective in preventing COVID-19 than not wearing a mask. Does that sound like backtracking? Does that have the punch and authority that people think it ought to have? The mask is the way you save your life. It appears that that's not the way you save your life, and that's what the CDC says as of just a couple months back. Indeed, it's still around 3%. Some personal protection, slightly more than no mask. So basically where we are is the old 3% position we were in. Indeed, back in 2015 in preventing COVID-19, not wearing a mask is not all that dangerous, and it's also not all that dangerous to other folks as well. We are not, if we don't wear a mask, that big a threat to anybody else, and those who wear a mask are not any safer primarily, except for perhaps a 3% margin, than the folks who don't wear a mask. Now, if that's the case, wear one if you want to cover that 3% spread. That's fine. It's okay with me. Don't shame me for not wearing one if I don't feel particularly threatened by that. As of today, as we speak, 16 states have no statewide mask mandates. In fact, as you know, several of them never did at all, most notable of which was South Dakota. Some of them never locked down. Their COVID rate has been about the same, or in some cases, interestingly enough, even a little lower than states with heavy mandates. Well, that's a pretty interesting statistic, isn't it? 16 states, by the way, that number is growing. What people are discovering is you can go back to work, you can go back to school. You don't need to wear the mask if you don't want to, but if you do, go ahead. You're not hurting anything, and neither is the person who's not wearing it. But we have engendered in the past 12 months a certain public point of view that has created a great deal of friction and tension among citizens. I find it rather fascinating that we have felt over the past 12 months the need to shame people who don't wear face masks. Virtue signaling, it's called. Social pressure designed to force others to perform as we wish they would or demand that they would. This new virtue signal, rather, is part motivated by such things as these goofy governors who had actually, in some states, laid down mandates that if you see somebody not wearing a mask or not social distancing or not washing their hands, turn them in, rat on them, let us know who they are so we can go after them, so we can hassle them or even in some cases arrest them. And we felt that's okay, let's do that, because after all, they're threatening me. Well, guess what? The science, if you're really interested in it, says they're not threatening you at all. They're not threatening you at all. Virtue signaling. Fist fights have broken out. There have been shootings. There's been the equivalent of road rage as a result of these matters. I mean, stop and think. How many things have you read in the newspaper about somebody who accosted somebody in a grocery store because they weren't wearing a mask? Now, on private property, the owner of that private property, the homeowner, the store owner, whatever, can, if they make it clear that this is their policy and they make it clear that this is their policy toward all, can in fact restrict certain behavior inside their premises. For example, if I've got white carpet in the living room and you come to visit me and I tell you I would like you to take your shoes off before you come in, and you refuse to do so, you might not be happy with me if I don't allow you in, but I might not allow you in. And, you know, you've heard the no shirt, no shoes, no service rule. It's applied to everyone, and that's the important thing. It has to be applied to everyone, not just to some select individuals. But you can do that sort of thing. And if I'm going to enter onto private property that requires me to wear a mask, I've got one, and I wear it. But other than that, I don't wear one, and I haven't this entire year. And I'm not going to. I don't find the reason behind it compelling enough. And I'm in the risk area, pushing 73. And what does I always follow the science and I want to unify the country president think of dropping mandatory mask wearing? He calls the leaders of those 16 states Neanderthals. Neanderthals. There's a bit of shaming, isn't it? There's a little bit of virtue signaling. One has to ask the question. In the end, one has to, if they're a critical thinker, explore the possibility that this whole thing isn't as much about science as science is the pretense for something else. Is this about science? Are you able to be absolutely certain that this is clearly about science? One would think that washing your hands frequently, wearing a mask, social distancing seems to be medical science speaking to us. Is this though really about public health? Is that really what this is about? Or is this about public submission? Think in 1 year's time how we have been more than willing to be controlled at a level that we have never thought we'd ever be controlled. This is not the first time this has happened. If you go back to 2001, remember the Patriot Act, which gave rise to the airport security policies we now follow, where you get searched and patted down and x-rayed and all the rest of that sort of thing, as though you may possibly be a terrorist. That's a freedom. That's a mobility freedom protected under the Constitution that we freely gave up. Our senators voted 100-0 without debate to pass the Patriot Act back in 2001. And we, without debate, acquiesced in the public policy of wearing masks and staying home and forfeiting our job and our livelihood and perhaps our future, and placed our children in jeopardy by not allowing them to go to school. I mean, in the end, if they ever do get back to the classroom, one presumes they will, but the question has to be asked, what situation will they be in academically and how long will it take to resolve the setback they have been exposed to? Is this about public submission? Or is this about public health? Is letting the big box store stay open while you close a small hardware store about public health or public submission? If you're going to arrest somebody for attending church, but you're going to allow Antifa to riot in the streets, is this about equal rights? Is this about freedom of expression? Is this about First Amendment? What we did not notice, I think, as we locked down and as we masked up in this past year, is that we let our fear of the unknown drive us into a false comfort when our leaders told us that they had everything under control. The longer away we get from the decision we made to follow them blindly, the more we realize that their sincerity was suspect. The longer we get from the time in which they swore up and down, the science tells us we've got to do this, it's not our choice, the more we realize that, guess what, the science didn't tell them that. Clearly, looking back, they did not follow the science, but we let them constructively deprive us of our constitutional rights. We let them constructively deprive us of the ability to live our lives as we choose and to submit to them and to their authority, even though if we had been critical thinkers and we studied what the genesis of their authority actually is, we discover that they were snowballing us. They were gaslighting. They don't have that authority. Never did. But we presume that they did, and that is a function of American ignorance, which I have spoken about before. If we know something about the Constitution, we're not going to be as willing to give up the rights, especially when we find no language that says, oh, but these rights do not apply in times of public health crisis. So ultimately, political science should raise a red flag whenever you encounter it, because political science isn't science at all. Political, that's why that word is in front of the word science, is about manipulating science and essentially prevailing upon a ignorant populace to believe that you're acting in the interest of science and you're forwarding policies that are essentially power grab. Bald-faced power grab. That's what was happening in our country in the last 12 months. A lot of us couldn't see the forest for the trees, but a lot more of us are beginning to recognize this now. And the question is, are we ever going to allow that to happen again? We went through a number of pandemics over the last 125 years. And in that period of time, we never did submit as much to government as we did this past 12 months. That's dangerous. It's frightening. And we had better be willing to make certain that we never allow that to happen to us again. I don't know how this thing ends. And I'm not making a political claim about this party or that party. The Republicans, the Democrats were equally at fault here. I am simply raising the issue that we must be critical thinkers when we are told it's this when it really may not be. And we must do this when we really don't have to. And we've got to buy in when we probably shouldn't. That's what this is about. I'll be back again on the 18th of this month with another edition of For Critical Thinkers. In the meantime, I thank you for watching. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this edition of For Critical Thinkers. Join Mike Fitzsimmons twice each month for a chance to share your views about important issues that affect our lives. Stay tuned to Spokane Talks for our next scheduled session.